Since the sunflower is the national flower of Ukraine, I thought my Monday Mini would be a sunflower. Now it's going to be a really loose sunflower. It's not really overly realistic. It's just a nice complementary color scheme with a really loose shadows and paint strokes in it. We're not getting too fussy with it. I want it to look loose and wild and just free. And I hope that one day soon that this stupid onslaught of Russia is stopped. But in the meantime, there's not a lot I can do as an individual, but I can give a nod to Ukraine and also help calm my own nerves and stress and anxiousness over Ukraine by painting. So that's what I'm going to do. That's all I can do right now as an individual, so I'm going to do what I can do. And as I can do more, that's what I'm going to do. But for right now, the only thing I can do is paint and pray. So just follow me along as I go around these petals really delicately, trying not to get too much purple on the petals. And once I get all of the background painted in, I will come back with a kneaded eraser, and I'm going to lift up some of those lines because my pencil lines are a little bit too dark. And if I try to paint the yellow of the sunflower over those lines, it's going to turn a gray color. It's not going to be pretty. So I'm going to lift up some of that graphite so it doesn't mix with my yellow paint. But I'll have to wait for that background to dry first. And then I'll go ahead and lift it up. Now, if you want to use a blow dryer, a hair dryer, or some kind of heat tool to dry it, go ahead. That'll speed up your process. So now I am going to go ahead and paint in the center. And I'm going with sort of an ochre, Naples yellow type mix. And I'm painting in that little center. And then in the very center, I am going to paint it with a nice dark brown. Like a burnt umber, something like that. Whatever you have on your palette, just a nice dark brown. It's contrasts really well with that Naples yellow. And I'm going to pull some of that brown up into the yellow while it's still a little bit wet and let it sort of blend in there. And my little dove is also cheering us on, telling us what a good job we are doing with our watercolor. Every time I talk, he just starts cooing. He thinks I'm talking to him. He is my biggest cheerleader. I love that little guy. I know, Dorian, we are painting. We are painting a beautiful sunflower in a nod to the Ukraine people and all of the horror that they're going through. So now I'm going to start on the petals, and I'm just using a really light lemony yellow and adding some orangey shadows to that. And I'm doing like a little bit at a time. I'm not getting too particular with it. I'm adding a little darker shadow, and that's just the yellow mixed with a little bit of brown and blending that in a little bit. This petal is sort of sticking up across the center of the flower. It's not laying down flat like the others. It's sort of sticking up, and so is the next petal. So we're just going to put the yellow on that, put in a little shadow, and we're just going to keep working our way around this sunflower, doing a few petals at a time, putting in the shadows, putting in the highlights and the midtones. Like I said, it's not really a totally realistic sunflower. We are just going for sort of a loose, impressionistic almost look. Now you can change the colors up. If you don't want to mix the brown in with your yellow to make it darker, you can use like a deep orange or a burnt orange or something like that. I don't have that on my palette, so I'm just sticking with the orange that I have. You can also use a little bit of magenta to mix in with the yellow, the darker yellow. That'll give you a nice shadow color as well. But it's really up to you. It's your painting. I'm just sticking with these colors that I have out already. I'm not trying to get too fancy with it. This is just a warm-up painting. It's our little Monday morning mini just to get us going, get our creative juices flowing. And it also helps center us, center our brains. At least it helps mine. Anytime I paint, it just calms my brain down and, helps me with any anxiety I might have. And right now I am anxious, very anxious for the country of Ukraine. And so I probably am going to paint all day long just to keep myself calm. Now I'm adding a really pale yellow to these petals, and I'm just going to go ahead and go all the way across a couple of petals at a time with this pale yellow. And then I'll come back in and put in the actual shadow work. You can do it however you want it. You can paint the whole sunflower with the pale yellow first. Let that dry and then come back in with your shadow colors if you like. You can do it the way I'm doing, a little bit at a time. There's really no right or wrong way to do it. Do it however it makes you comfortable. Just make sure, that you have your values in there, the darks and the lights like you want them. And your shadow colors as well. And my little sunflower's starting to look like a sunflower. I'm adding a little brighter orange around here and in some of those shadow places. And Dorian, my little dove, is really liking it. He's giving us his opinion. Yes, he is. And I'm just going around with that really pale yellow and painting in a few more petals as I go. I'm going to let some of this dry and then come back later as it's more dry with the darker shadows. So right now I'm just getting in the underpainting of yellow. And I'm going to come in with the orange or the darker orange and just painting those little shadows and the little shadow shapes. And it makes it look a little softer while it's still wet. And we're just going to keep working around this beautiful little sunflower. And I'm just blending with the tip of my paintbrush in some areas where it's a little bit too dark for me. So I'm just going to blend that out with a little clean water. Then continue around the petals with that pale yellow. And then as we work around, we're just going to continue to add shadows. I'm going to come back in this center, darken that up just a little bit. It's a little bit drier now, so I'm just going to add a few more darker details into that center and right around the edges, just to give it a little bit more interest. I'm going to come in with some dark yellowish orange color for some more shadows in that bright yellow, that really pale yellow. Again, it's just a sort of impressionistic. It's not meant to be overly realistic, and it's just really meant to calm your nerves and to get your creative juices flowing for this week ahead. It's going to be a long week, I have a feeling. And I'm just darkening up some areas right around those petals, just to give it a little bit more detail, a little bit more separation. I'm darkening up the shadows under these two petals that are sticking straight out. And we're just going to keep working our way around, adding the shadow shapes. Now you can do your shadow shapes any way that you want. I don't really have a reference photo that I'm using, so I'm just sort of doing this from imagination, if you will. So you can put your shadow shapes any way you want to. Just remember that, there's going to be a shadow underneath the top flower petals. The bottom flower petals underneath are going to be darker. The ones on top are going to be lighter. Just remember your principles of how light hits an object and how it will play on an object. That's the main thing you have to remember. And you can put in your own shadows wherever you'd like them. As long as you just keep those principles in mind of how light and shadow works, where your light source is coming from, those kind of things. Now I'm adding in a little bit more detail just to right around that center. Now I've switched over. I've got some really pale greenish yellow and I've got some olive green. And I'm just going to go ahead and start painting in parts of the leaf and the little sepals that are around the back part of the sunflower. And I'm adding some of that olive in to some areas where I want shadows and where I want it to be a little bit darker. And I've gotten just a little bit more pigment, some really dark green pigment, and I'm going ahead and putting in some more really dark shadows in some areas. Again, you can pick your own areas where you think it would look good. You don't have to follow my suit. You don't have to follow my painting exactly. Make it your own. And I'm adding some sort of medium green with, it's a little bit of olive green mixed with a little bit of sap green into some areas and just adding some shapes, just giving it interest. Again, impressionistic. We're not going for realistic. Now we're going to work on the sepals, going with that really dark green and pulling those sepals over on in front of the leaf. And it's looking pretty good. And I'm going to add a little bright green in some areas right under the petals. And those are just the sepals sort of peeking out from under that flower. And that's starting to bring our flower out even more with that little bit of green under it. Gives it a nice contrast. And we are almost finished. Add a little green. And once I get that green on some of these petals, just get that little hue going. You know how the sun will kind of shine through and the sepals, the reflection of the sepals can come through on some of the petals. So that's why I'm adding a little bit of green. It's totally optional for you. You don't have to do that if it doesn't suit you. Now I'm just going to come back and darken up some of the shadow work on the flower petals and maybe add a little bit more interest in some areas. Here and there, I'm darkening up the stem a little bit, darkening up the leaf. Yes, Dorian, we're almost finished. I hear you cheering me on. I'm just going to take that dark brown and add a little bit of texture in the center. Totally optional. If you like your center the way it is, leave it the way it is. I'm just darkening mine up just a little bit and adding a little bit of texture in there. Also darkening up some shadows on those petals so that some of them pop out a little bit more than the other ones. And kind of getting in between those petals. And then once I get that darker shadow in, I'm just going to come back with some clean water. And we're just going to blend that out a little bit. We don't want it to be too harsh. So just going to run our wet brush along the edges. We're going to add a little bit more color into some of the petals where it needs it. And I think we're almost finished. Let me take the tape off and we're going to look at it. Not all the way happy, but I have to remind myself that this is just a warm-up exercise. It's not meant to be fine art. So what I'm doing is I'm taking my bleed proof white from Dr. P.H. Martin, and I'm just highlighting some of those petals with that white. Now I have mixed a little bit of water into the bleed proof white so that it's a little bit thinner. And I'm also going to add some texture in the center of the flower with just some little dots. I'm also putting a few veins in those leaves, a few highlights down the stem, and I'm liking this much better. Just put a few little highlights in the form of dots in that very center. And so now I think I'm very much more happy. If you enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up. And if you love art as much as I do, please consider subscribing to my channel and hit that bell so you'll never miss a video. Thanks for watching, guys. I really appreciate it.